Rogue Trader had a painting guide in it. Let's check it out. The subject of collecting, painting and converting metal and plastic miniatures is a vast one, and one which could quite easily fill a whole book. This chapter of the video covers the basics of buying, assembling and painting models, be they metal or plastic. Citadel Miniatures have long been known as the foremost producer of metal gaming miniatures, combining the talents of some of the world's best miniature sculptors and the most advanced production techniques at the time. Citadel's excellent range of Warhammer 40,000 figures has been produced in close cooperation with the game's designers and contributors. In fact, some of the sculptors were avid Warhammer 40,000 players and helped to design and test the game. As well as the metal models, Citadel then produced a limited number of plastic models which are available at a greatly reduced cost compared to their metal counterparts. Once painted, they cannot be told apart until they're picked up. So plastic miniatures are the norm these days, with a few resin miniatures thrown in amongst them. Do Games Workshop still make any miniatures in metal, or have they been phased out completely? Although it's very easy to buy a new model on impulse, and I know of no one who doesn't, it is more efficient to think about your forces and plan your purchases carefully. If you are a member of a regular gaming group, it is a good idea for each player to stick to a particular theme or race. One player concentrating on Space Marines, whilst another dedicates resources to Eldar or Orcs, for example. Of course, most of your battles will involve humans, so several or all members of a group could collect some human troops. There are lots of human types to collect anyway, varying from medieval feral worlders to imperial troopers, the household troops of planetary governors and pirates, for example. One player might like to concentrate on monsters and weird aliens. It always seems to be the GM who ends up collecting these more way out creatures. It's interesting that the advice given back in the day was to start with just one army, as opposed to the buy everything advice we get today. Players should try to build up a comprehensive force of their chosen race. The best way to do this is buy a whole unit at once, usually 10 models. In the case of most races, this will mean 6 or 7 basic troopers, an officer, and perhaps 2 or 3 special weapons. The variety in weapons and poses will make painting more interesting, and once finished, you will have a useful unit. It is also quicker to paint lots of models at once, so your armies will grow faster than they would if you were buying in dribs and drabs, as it were. Now, I've always found that batch painting is always considerably faster than singular painting, and I think that is a fact, and don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise. Unless they're a madman and they're able to do such things. Citadel figures are now widely available, and any good model shop and even some high street retailers will be able to offer you a wide selection. Wherever you obtain models, try to choose those which are the cleanest and most perfect castings. Rubber molds are flexible and soft, but they do not last forever, and the models they produce may vary slightly from batch to batch. Although all those offered for sale should have crisp detail and no malformities. Some degree of excess metal originating from air vents in the mould, or from metal seepage within the mould, is unavoidable, and such models can be easily cleaned up before painting. So make sure you have a good rifle through the stock. Pick all the good ones out and leave all the shit casts for the next person to buy. The joys of metal miniatures. Sadly, plastic miniatures can have flash and mould lines on them, especially old casts. But the new ones definitely are a hell of a lot better than they were 10 or 20 years ago. They're better at hiding the mould lines now. Before painting, all metal models should be cleaned up with a small modelling file and/or modelling knife. The moulds used to make metal figures come in two halves, and seepage between them will result in a slight mould line, a thin ridge of metal running around the model from top to bottom. If this seepage is extensive, it may form a film of foil-thin metal between the model's extremities, and it is then called flash. Both mould lines and flash can be dealt with using your modelling knife, the single most useful tool you can own. Thin strands of metal sometimes adhere to models and should be cut off. These are where air vents have been cut or drilled into the mould to let air escape. They are easily removed with a knife and file. These venting strands are not imperfections in the model, but a good sign. If the air vents fill with metal, this means no air has been trapped in the mould to produce a little bubble or cavity. If you find any little cavities of this kind, you will know it's due to a tiny bubble of trapped air in the mould. But small holes may be acceptable as they are easily filled in or just painted over.
There's always a hole that needs filling. So today's big question is, how do you like to fill your holes? Let us know what you think the best gap filler on the market is. Do you use super glue? Do you like to bung in a bit of green stuff? Or do you just leave them with a big gash?
As Citadel models come with a separate plastic base, they will have to be fixed before you can start painting. Use a 2-part epoxy resin glue such as Araldite for this. Spread the glue in the prepared slit and on the corresponding tab before pushing the model home. If the figure won't stand up in the slit, you can support it with plasticine for a few minutes to give the glue a chance to work. Don't worry about getting glue on top of the base, as any excess will be covered over at the next stage.
Does Araldite still exist? Let me look it up. Yes, it does. I remember using Araldite back in the 1990s. It was a big deal back then for some reason. I think it was like the professional's choice.
Once the figure has been attached to its base, a decorative ground coating can be applied. This base should match in with your gaming setup and must be done so that it won't appear incompatible whether your game is fought in a jungle or on the streets. This is a matter of taste. You can make your bases look like paving slabs, but this will look funny amongst jungles. You can make your bases look like foliage, but this might look odd amongst the city streets. A good compromise is to apply a rough texture finish to the base and paint it in a neutral shade of grey or brown. This will look reasonable in most circumstances.
This sounds like an all-comers approach to basing. These days people like to be a lot more thematic with their basing. You know, you'd have all snow bases, or all jungle bases, or all urban bases, or lava bases perhaps. What do you guys prefer? Do you like some generic basing so you can stick it on any old table? Or do you like to theme your bases and risk having those snow bases on a lava board?
The texture is applied by mixing PVA glue with sand or fine grit. This yummy mixture can be pasted onto the base's upper surface using a cocktail stick or something similar, maybe a lollipop stick. Try to avoid getting the glue mixture onto the model itself. An alternative finish can be obtained by using a ready mixed filler, such as Tetrion. This can be left plain or sprinkled with sand, grit, or fine modeller's flock when wet. If you like, patches of flock or sand can be glued to the Tetrion surface once it's dry. This gives the effect of sparse vegetation or broken ground. Whatever method you adopt, it is best to leave the sides of the base plain and undecorated.
I've never heard of Tetrion before. I have no idea what that is. Wonder if they still make it. Let's have a look. Yes, they do. It's like a filler. I think they call it spackle in America.
Plastic models are moulded in high-resolution rigid polystyrene and come as kits for the modeller to assemble. This format allows a certain latitude in poses and equipment, so that no two models need look exactly alike. Firstly, wash the whole kit with warm water and a little washing up liquid to remove any grease remaining from the steel moulds. Before construction, separate the pieces from the supporting frame using a modelling knife and clean up any mould lines in the same way as for metal figures. Assembly is easy, using standard polystyrene cement. The liquid sort is recommended.
Liquid polystyrene cement. Does that imply there's a solid polystyrene cement out there somewhere? What good would that be? I'd use my brick of polystyrene cement. It probably just means there's a less viscous version of it, like a goopy version.
Carefully apply a small amount of glue to both parts to be joined. Wait a few seconds for the glue to take hold and firmly press both parts together. If the parts remain loose or spongy, you're using too much glue. Only a tiny amount is necessary for a firm grip. The model can be glued to its base at any convenient stage, and the base textured in exactly the same way as for metal figures. Plastic models will feel somewhat lightweight compared to those made from metal, and may be weighted with plasticine pressed underneath the base. This will stop them falling over quite so much and gives a much nicer feel.
I don't like the idea of using plasticine because it never sets hard. Milliput or clay, I think, would be a much better choice. Or you could glue a coin up underneath perhaps. To the bottom of the base, I mean.
Whether models are metal or plastic, they will accept paint far more readily if properly undercoated first. If this is not done, the colours won't show up properly. The bare surface may show through and the paint will wear away very quickly. An undercoat is simply an all-over covering of white paint. Experienced painters will know that special effects can be achieved using coloured undercoats, but for most purposes, white is the best. It is most convenient to undercoat a whole batch of models at once, as this will save time, materials and effort. Almost any white paint will do the job: enamel, acrylic or Plaka.
Something else I've never heard of. Plaka. I'm going to assume this is another mid-80s painting product. My gut tells me it's a bit like gesso.
The undercoat can be applied with a largish brush, a size 3 for example, and the aim should be to completely cover the model with a thin coat. If the undercoat is too thick, it will obscure the underlying detail. If the paint is too thick straight from the pot, dilute it so that it produces a nice thin white coat. Perhaps the most efficient way to undercoat a batch of models is to use a car repair spray can of matte white primer. Place the models in a tray or box to contain the spray and go outside. Spraying indoors is definitely no good. The fumes are horrible and it's impossible to fully contain the spray. When spraying out of doors, remember your box will not contain all of the paint, so whatever you place your box on will end up with a nice white ring. It's best to lay down some paper and avoid spraying onto patio paving and concrete floors at all costs. Make sure there's no wind, rain, snow, volcanic eruptions, etc., and hold the can about a foot from the models and spray with light, smooth strokes. Don't aim to soak or completely cover the models in one go. Then turn your box around and spray the other side. Once dry, you can reposition your figures to catch undercuts and awkward angles. Each coat will build up the overall covering without drenching the models. Any difficult bits can be filled in with a brush later.
It's interesting how white was touted as the go-to undercoat colour back in the day. These days people seem to prefer black. I wonder if that's because the paints didn't cover very well then, and if you used a black undercoat, it just wouldn't work.
Old-fashioned oil and enamel-based colours are rarely used these days. since there are many excellent water-based paints now available. These are thinned with water, and brushes can also be cleaned with the water, avoiding the need for smelly, brush-destroying terps and white spirit. Viewers who are familiar with and used to using enamel paints and turpentine will find these are perfectly good for metal models, and all of the techniques described for water paints can be applied to enamels. Most gamers will wish to use water-based paints, however, and so only types of these kind have been described.
I don't think many people use enamel paints these days, do they? Maybe some military modelers perhaps, but most enamel products are usually used just for weathering and things.
Acrylic paints are based on water, but are also waterproof once dry. All of the hobby paints are of this type, including Citadel Colour, which is specifically made for painting Citadel models. All acrylics are mixable and interchangeable, so if you find a shade you like from one manufacturer, it will mix perfectly easily with paints produced by someone else. As well as the modelling paints sold in hobby shops, you can buy acrylics in tubes from art shops. These are generally thicker than modelling paints and may lose covering power if thinned, but are useful all the same. Plaka is a special craft paint sold in art shops. It comes in large jars, which work out at great value if you need lots of paint. It is water-based like acrylic, and it can be intermixed with it. If you undercoat by brush, a large pot of white Plaka is the best material to use, and like acrylic, it's waterproof once dry.
Yet more mentions of that Plaka stuff. I feel I need to find out what that is, but not today. Let's move on.
Gouache is an old-fashioned sort of watercolour with a glue base. It can be bought in art shops and usually comes in small tubes. Until recently, gouache provided the best colour range for water-based paint. However, as this is no longer quite true, gouache is best avoided as it is not waterproof when dry and tends to rub off if handled too much. Some gouache mixes with other water-based paint though.
I used gouache a lot when I was studying art at college. I really liked using it, but I can't remember why. It's been a long time since then.
Poster paints are a little coarse for our purposes, and like gouache, are not waterproof when dry and handle very poorly. However, the metallic paints from these ranges are often excellent and well worth buying.
Now, as a youngster, I painted some Street Fighter 2 murals on my bedroom walls, and I used poster paint for that. If it got wet, it would just smudge off. You could lick the paint off. It never fully dried. They did look good though. Sure you can!
Is he saying, are you Ken?
Sure you can! Never forget that. Big Ken doing a dragon punch on the wall I had. God, it's fantastic. Should have taken a picture of it, but we didn't really have access to cameras as easily back then. We didn't have one in your pocket like you do nowadays.
Your choice of colours will depend on your subject matter, but you will need a minimum of black, white, red, blue, yellow, red, green and brown. The Citadel Colour Paint Set 1 provides all of these colours at a bargain price and is highly recommended. By mixing the various colours, you can produce different shades, and you can always add more colours at a later date. Difficult colours to mix, therefore good ones to buy, are dark blues, dark reds and crimsons, and all strong shades of brown. Flesh is worth buying if you find yourself mixing this colour a lot.
Nowadays, there are a lot of different paint colours available. Mixing your own has almost gone the way of the dodo, a dead extinct bird.
Brushes are the single most important item in the painter's armoury. All paint is pretty much the same, but you can't expect to produce a good paint job with a horrible old bit of yak's tail on a stick. A good brush makes painting easier, faster and more fun. A good brush should be made from sable, and it should come to a nice point when moistened between your finger and thumb, and it also shouldn't have any odd, sticking out or overly long bristles. Examine your brush carefully in the shop.
I find brushes I look at in the shops to always be in terrible condition. They've usually been fiddled with, prized and poked about, and all the hairs are sticking out at random angles. They're terrible. And buying online can also be risky, as you don't get to see the goods before you buy them. Can any of you guys recommend a reputable online brush store? It would be nice to know of one in the UK and one in the US. They're the biggest audiences we have here on the channel. I'm not saying we don't want to know where there are other ones in Europe or Asia or Australia, but there's not many people watching from those parts.
Art shops will often provide a dish of water so that buyers can point brushes. Artists take buying a brush seriously, and so should you.
I have never seen this in the shops, but customer service these days is awful compared to what it used to be. There's not much of a buyer's experience anymore.
Good brushes sadly don't come cheap, so choose carefully. You will need a number 1 for general work and a number 0 or 00 for fine detail. However, a good number 1 should come to a fine point and will give as good detail as the smallest brush. It's just that a small brush is easier to handle when painting unusually fine or recessed detail. Painting textured bases, applying undercoat, varnishing and dry brushing are very hard wearing on brushes, so use an old brush or buy cheap ones for these purposes. A cheap number 2 or 3 will prove very useful for large areas and brush undercoating.
I actually prefer bigger sized brushes now, but also different brands have different sizes. A Winsor & Newton size 1 might be different to a Rosemary & Co size 1, for example.
It goes without saying that having spent a king's ransom on brushes, you will want to look after them. Never leave brushes standing in water, as this will bend the bristles completely out of shape. Clean brushes after use with soapy water and stand them point upwards in a jar. Make sure the part where the bristles meet the metal ferrule is clean and tweak off any rogue bristles as they appear.
I can't argue with that, it's spot on.
You will need a steady flat surface such as a table, good light, daylight is best, at least 1 jar of water and a mixing palette. An old plate or tile is ideal. Protect your work surface with a thick layer of newspaper and place your paints and water around you so that they can be reached comfortably. Water should be clean to avoid fouling paint, and it is a good idea to have a separate jar for cleaning and thinning metallic colours. Otherwise, metallic bits will start appearing in all your other paints. The palette is used for mixing and storing the paint you are using, and should ideally be white to show the colours.
Now, I've seen people prime their palettes grey or black to see what their colours look like over those primers. A dry palette, not a wet palette. Priming a wet palette would make a hell of a mess.
It is easier to paint several figures at once, rather than to start and complete one at a time. Work through your batch of models, painting all the blue bits, all the red bits, etc. By the time you've worked through the batch, the first figures will be dry and ready for the next colour. It is usually easiest to paint a figure from the inside out, starting with the skin and working outwards through the layers of clothing, finishing with equipment. Initially, just concentrate on getting the paint in the right places and don't worry too much about shading or highlighting. By painting outwards from the skin, you'll make it easier to cover up mistakes as you go along, but only practice will improve your technique.
I myself have always used the inside out technique. I think I learnt it from a High Elf painting guide back in the day. Was it 4th edition Warhammer Fantasy that had the straight up high elves? I say straight up, the monopose ones. They just stood there with a... What the f*** is the name of that? They just stood there with a stick with a point on the end. A spear and a shield, I think. It was like a long shield with a dragon on it, maybe. And chainmail vests. Anyway, I'm digressing.
The last thing to paint is the base. which can be any neutral shade of grey, brown or even green. The edges of the base are best painted black, which will show the model off against the terrain.
This is obviously set before the goblin green basing phenomenon. Now if you fancy coming to chat basing or retro painting or anything else hobby related, then please feel free to come along and join us on our friendly Discord server, which is not behind a paywall. There's a link in the description below or up here somewhere. We look forward to chatting to you there.
There are many tricks of the trade. Those interested are best referred to the many articles that appear in the Citadel Journal and White Dwarf magazines. Blacklining is a simple form of shading used to emphasize contrast. Basically, any change in colour or material is marked by painting a black line or very dark shade of some other colour. For example, where a model's hand appears from its cuff, a black line is painted where the two join, and where a hand grips a gun, a black line painted to separate the flesh from the metal. This technique looks great if done carefully and can be combined with other shading techniques discussed later.
I'm a sucker for blacklining because I think it looks good.
Shading creases in clothing and recessed detail can be painted with a darker shade of the surrounding colour to represent a shadow. Where a progressive graduation is required, 2 or more darker shades can be used, each shade representing a deeper area of shadow. Painting areas of shadow is time consuming, and most painters prefer to use washes as described later. Highlighting raised areas will catch the light and so appear lighter than their surroundings. This can be represented by painting such areas with a lighter shade of the base colour, in exactly the opposite way to shading. As this takes rather a long time, many artists prefer to use dry brushing to achieve the same result.
I think what they're describing is layering, a very popular method of painting these days.
Washing is a quick and effective way of representing shadows. A wash is prepared by using a dark shade of the base colour and diluting this with water. The ideal consistency is very dirty water, rather than thin paint, but you must experiment to obtain the right consistency for your needs. This wash is then painted all over the area to be shaded, and the paint naturally falls into the cracks in detail, forming a realistic graded shadow. Raised areas can be wiped with a tissue or finger to remove any residue of paint, but this is not necessary if your wash is sufficiently thin. Some artists use water-based ink to make washes, as these give a harsher shadow, but these are expensive and only recommended for the experienced.
I think people use a more saturated or thicker wash these days. I haven't seen many dirty water washes being used myself. It just sounds too thin. It sounds like the pigment would wash out of it and go funny. Might be worth a try though. Have any of you guys tried it?
Dry brushing is a quick and pleasing way of representing highlights. Prepare a lighter shade of the base colour and dip the brush into the paint. Then wipe away most of the paint, leaving only a slight residue of the light colour. Drawing the brush against the whole area, pigment is deposited only on the raised areas, producing instant highlights. It is important to experiment to find the right amount of paint to use. Successively lighter shades can be built up if you're careful.
Now for some reason people like to frown upon dry brushing. Stuck up elitists I call those. I quite like dry brushing and I'm starting to use more of it again in my day-to-day painting.
Emphasising details such as buttons, buckles and other small raised items can be accomplished by painting the whole item plus a small area around it black. The item can then be painted a different colour, leaving a very fine black line around it. This technique can be applied to larger areas before painting, providing a similar finish to blacklining.
It's not similar, it's the same.
Metallics and difficult shades may need a special undercoat. Metallic paint and some light shades of brown and yellow do not sit well on top of white paint. The white will show through and the finish is patchy. To compensate for this, another colour is painted onto the area first as a sort of second undercoat. In the case of silver, the best undercoat colour is black or grey. In the case of red metals, the best colour is brown. Light yellows will go over pale browns or darker shades of the same colour. Paint varies, and you may be able to find better colours to suit your purposes.
I'm going to try that gold over brown next time. I've not seen that done before. It sounds very good. Now, speaking of things that are very good, if you're enjoying this video, then please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. That means you, Ian. If you are enjoying the content on the channel, then please consider joining us on Patreon, the link to which is in the description below, or up here somewhere. Or you could even become a channel member, which is all the rage these days. Again, there's a link in the description below.
This chart shows you how you can use lighter or darker shades to produce highlights and shadows. It can be used with all the techniques described above. When mixing shades, remember lighter tones are lighter, not whiter, and darker tones are deeper, not blacker. Applying white and black will work to some extent, but if overdone, will simply produce a shade that looks either washed out or dirty. Darker shades of red may be obtained by adding a small amount of green to the base colour. Similarly, a darker shade of green may be produced by adding a small amount of red. Neither will give as pure a tint as a real crimson or bottle green pigment. Blue is difficult to darken, and it's best to buy a separate dark blue colour, such as an artist's cobalt or Prussian blue, or an equivalent hobby paint.
Do you think that OLDHAMMER painting guide was useful? Let us know what you think in the comments below. If you want to see some more OLDHAMMER themed videos, then check out the playlist up here somewhere. And as always, thank you very much for watching.